Check out our new game Master of Command 7 Years War. Fight line battles in real time, manage and customize your own army, wage war in a dynamic and replayable campaign. Wishlisting on Steam and subscribing to our dev channel would help out tremendously. On April 12, 1861, soldiers of the newly proclaimed Confederate States of America opened fire on Fort Sumter. With every shell that slammed into the fort's crumbling walls, the fissures that had long been spreading through American society were slowly blasted into gaping chasms. To the rebelling Confederates, the boom of cannon fire signaled a righteous Second War of Independence. To the rest of the world, the American Civil War had just begun, and the Confederacy had struck the first blow. Accurate intelligence, or lack thereof, was an important factor in some of the military decisions made by generals on both sides during the Civil War. Being able to protect or hide your activities from those looking to know who you are and what you're doing is just as important today as it was then. And that's why NordVPN, the world's premier cybersecurity platform and the sponsor of today's video, is such a crucial tool in keeping your online activities safe and secure. Very recently, almost 3 billion records, each listing a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number, and phone number, were stolen by hackers. Visit nordvpn.com/historyvpn and learn how Nord tools like Threat Protection Pro keep you and your data safe from malware and online threats by blocking fake, malicious websites used for phishing, fraud, or scam. Or how Dark Web Monitor continuously scans discovered hacker hangouts and immediately alerts you if your personal information is up for sale. My team and I make extensive use of email and instant messaging services like Discord to coordinate and collaborate, so protecting ourselves from online threats is vitally important. If you'd like to support our channel, try NordVPN today with a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee and get 4 extra bonus months on a 2-year plan. Simply sign up using our link in the description below, or visit nordvpn.com/historyvpn and start protecting yourself today. Throughout the 19th century, wealthy American Southerners had constructed an immensely profitable economic system based on the export of cotton. This fibrous plant, key to the industrializing world, only seemed to go up in price and made the American South the 4th richest economy in the world. Underpinning all of this wealth, however, was the enslavement of millions of Black Americans. Without slavery, the prosperous way of life for many wealthy Southerners would crumble into ruin, and so slavery is what they would protect at all costs. The Southern fixation on slavery put them increasingly at odds with their Northern counterparts, who looked at the institution with increasing suspicion. Some radical Northerners even began to discuss a nationwide ban or abolition of slavery. To the slave-dependent South, nothing was more terrifying. All levels of Southern society had an interest in preserving slavery. Throughout the South, 25% of all white families owned slaves, with much higher percentages in the lower South. For these families, the abolition of slavery would bring economic ruin. Poor Southerners were also deeply opposed to abolition, as slavery was the one thing that stood between them and the bottom of Southern society. White Southerners also widely feared that abolition would lead to a devastating race war. Therefore, Northern anti-slavery attitudes weren't just seen as economically threatening, but socially degrading and violently subversive. Alarmingly, as Northern opposition to slavery grew, Southern power waned. Mass immigration had led to a population explosion in the North, proportionally reducing Southern political representation. Furthermore, Northern factories, banks, and merchants increasingly dominated Southern trade and threatened to undermine the South's agrarian economy. Concerned Southerners began to speak of their perceived vassalage to the North. To hold on to their political power, the South needed new allies. Slavery had to be expanded. As the United States expanded westward, the South demanded that these new territories be opened up to slavery. Northerners, and especially the newly formed Republican Party, heavily disagreed and insisted that slavery should be contained to its existing home in the South. Worse still, Republicans hoped to obstruct the return of escaped slaves to the South. By the 1850s, many Southerners considered the Republican Party to be their mortal enemies and condemned them as Black Republicans. In these deeply racist times, there could be no worse insult. After decades of negotiations and compromises, tensions finally reached a boiling point in the territory of Kansas, where the status of slavery was controversially left to a local vote. Pro-slavery Southerners began to move to Kansas with the intention of voting to allow slavery in the territory. These political transplants were soon followed by anti-slavery Northerners with the opposite intentions. Bitter violence soon broke out as partisan newspapers egged on their polarized readers, and both sides committed spiraling atrocities. Southerners and Northerners alike began to refer to Bleeding Kansas. In the quickly escalating Kansas conflict, a Northern abolitionist named John Brown gained prominence. A fanatical opponent against slavery, Brown set his sights beyond Kansas and forcefully entered Virginia in 1859, where he attempted to instigate a slave uprising. Though Brown's plan ultimately ended in his capture and execution, to Southerners, this radical abolitionism had seemingly led to the brink of racial Armageddon. Enraging Southerners even more, the Northern public viewed Brown as a martyr and not as a vicious terrorist. With emotions high, Southerners had never felt more threatened by the anti-slavery forces of the North. Southern anxiety turned to panic with the 1860 presidential nomination of Republican Abraham Lincoln. Demonized for years in the South, the Republican Party advocated to legislate slavery into oblivion and was therefore viewed as an existential threat to the Southern way of life. Republican supporters had committed monstrous crimes in Kansas. They had cheered on John Brown's terrifying raid, and they could certainly not be allowed in the White House. However, outnumbered Southern votes could do little to stop this Republican tide. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as America's 16th president. For Southern voters, this was a nightmare scenario. Southerners were convinced that Lincoln and his Black Republicans would appoint opponents of slavery to every national office, incite devastating slave rebellions, eviscerate the Southern economy, and corrupt Southern society. With the country soon to be in the hands of a perceived radical who had not received a single electoral vote in the South, opposing politicians began to demand that the honor, liberty, and safety of Southern whites could now only be assured by one thing: secession. South Carolina was the first state to act, seceding from the United States on December 20th, 1860. Justifying its secession, South Carolina pointed to an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slave-holding states to the institution of slavery, and the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. South Carolina was soon joined by 6 other states in the Lower South, who formed the Confederate States of America in February of 1861. Just a month later, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as president of a divided America. Wealthy Southerners claimed that secession was a legal solution to their desire to preserve slavery. Just in case, though, any opposition to secession was suppressed and the matter was not put to a popular vote. Most inhabitants of the Lower South soon fell in line. However, parts of the Upper South, who were less uniformly dependent on slavery, were hesitant to leave the Union. Nevertheless, These states firmly declared that any military action against their seceding neighbors would not be tolerated by them. In their eyes, the ball was now in Lincoln's court. The spark that finally blew this political powder keg into all-out war was the confrontation at Fort Sumter. Garrisoned by federal troops, this South Carolina island fortress had been placed under informal siege by the newly minted Confederate Army. With supplies running low, Lincoln announced his intention to resupply the island. To the Confederacy, this was an affront to their sovereignty. Confederate President Jefferson Davis decided that a show of force was in order. On April 12, 1861, the shells began to fly. With the outbreak of war, 4 more states joined the Confederate cause. Even so, the Confederacy found itself at a severe disadvantage. Compared to the Union's 20 million citizens, the Confederacy only boasted a population of 9 million, of which almost 4 million were enslaved. Southern factories were outnumbered 10 to 1 by their northern counterparts and produced 15 times less iron, 38 times less coal, and 32 times fewer firearms. Outnumbered and outgunned, it was abundantly clear to Southern leaders that they would be unable to win their independence if they relied on brute force. In Southern eyes, however, the apparent advantage of the North was initially of little concern. The Confederacy was confident that European powers such as Britain and France would intervene on the South's behalf in order to protect their valuable cotton supplies. Like the American revolutionaries who inspired them, Confederate strategists believed that they just had to fight long enough to wear down the morale of their opponents and force political change. In the meantime, the assumed martial prowess of white Southerners could no doubt keep the hordes of weak Northerners at bay. Victory would just be a matter of time. Expecting a short war, Southern men enlisted in the Confederate Army for a variety of overlapping reasons. After years of mounting tensions, many Confederates felt that Northern overreach threatened aspects of Southern society, such as rural autonomy and slavery, that gave their families a sense of liberty and stability. As local communities took up arms together, many felt that their honor as men depended on fighting, but there would be little honor in the next 4 years of darkness. Following some minor clashes with Northern forces in the summer of 1861, Confederate troops got their first true taste of battle in July of that year near Manassas Junction, Virginia. In the heat of battle, General Thomas Jackson stood like a stone wall, earning him his nickname and preventing a Confederate collapse. The First Battle of Manassas, as it became known in the South, ended in a Confederate victory, but shattered any illusions that the war would be a quick and bloodless affair. As Union forces regrouped, the Confederacy spread its troops across the entire border with the North, hoping that its small armies would be able to reinforce each other in the event of a Union assault. This strategy proved flawed. Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant defeated a smaller Confederate force at the Battle of Shiloh, and a further string of Union victories in 1862 broke Confederate lines in the West. Adding to the building crisis, a Union fleet sailed into New Orleans, depriving the Confederacy of its largest city and seaport. In the East, the Confederacy came to the brink of catastrophe when a Union army nearly captured the Confederate capital of Richmond. Fearing disaster, President Davis appointed General Robert E. Lee to lead the defense of the city. In a string of victories, Lee soon repulsed the overly cautious Union forces and solidified himself as one of the most skilled Confederate generals. Hoping to seize the initiative, Lee launched an invasion of Northern territory in the fall of 1862. Lee took a gamble by splitting his forces, leaving some under the command of Stonewall Jackson as he continued to advance north. This decision almost proved fatal when Lee's invasion plans mysteriously fell into the hands of a nearby Union army over twice his size. Luckily, Northern commanders hesitated just long enough for Lee to concentrate most of his remaining forces near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Here, he would make his stand. On September 17, 1862, the Battle of Sharpsburg began. Union troops hit the Confederate lines in a series of piecemeal attacks that failed to take advantage of their overwhelming numerical superiority. Nevertheless, Confederate forces were barely able to hang on. Casualties were enormous, and the center of the Confederate Army became dangerously close to breaking. As fighting continued throughout the day, the arrival of Southern reinforcements brought an end to what was now the bloodiest day in American history. Tactically, the Battle of Sharpsburg had been a draw, but soon after the engagement, Lee's savaged forces were obliged to pull back to Confederate territory. To the dismay of white Southerners, the failure of Lee's invasion gave Abraham Lincoln the confidence to announce his Emancipation Proclamation, which promised to abolish slavery in the Confederacy. To the anti-slavery public of the Confederacy's prospective European allies, this document was electric. Britain and France would not openly fight for slavery or Confederate independence. The South's most promising path to victory lay in ruins. Despite the bleak intentional outlook, the Confederacy continued to stymie Northern attempts to end the war. In the West, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant advanced down the Mississippi River, but were tied down by the Confederate defenders of Vicksburg. In the East, Lee defeated a larger Northern invasion force at Fredericksburg and won a masterful victory at Chancellorsville. Despite mourning the tragic death of Stonewall Jackson, Lee now had the confidence to launch a new invasion of the North in the summer of 1863. In early June, Lee's troops crossed into Pennsylvania, beginning their attack on the North. Fresh off of previous victories, Confederate troops were confident, sometimes cocky. On July 1st, near the town of Gettysburg, Confederate optimism was reinforced when they bested a smaller Northern contingent. However, Lee had underestimated the size of Union forces in the area and soon found himself outnumbered in what was to become the deadliest battle of the entire war. With Union troops fortified on the heights south of Gettysburg, Lee attempted to break Northern lines and achieve a decisive victory. On July 2nd, Confederate forces engaged in brutal combat on the Union flanks, which buckled but did not break. Hoping to achieve a breakthrough, Lee ordered his forces to concentrate on the Union center on July 3rd, but this too ended in failure. Though he had inflicted heavy losses on his opponent, Lee's own forces had been devastated, and he was forced to limp back to Confederate territory. Just one day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, Confederate troops at Vicksburg finally surrendered to General Grant, forfeiting control over the Mississippi River and cutting the Confederacy in half. The defeat was made all the more bitter by the fact that Lee had refused to send reinforcements to the rapidly collapsing Western theater, betting instead on his now failed invasion of the North. The military situation of the Confederacy was becoming increasingly dire. Behind the front lines, the war was also taking its toll. A tightening Union blockade significantly complicated Confederate efforts to export cotton, and Southern politicians refused to raise desperately needed taxes. As a result, inflation ran out of control. The ongoing war also severely disrupted the institution of slavery, as countless Black Americans took their freedom into their own hands, emboldened by the Emancipation Proclamation. With cotton never harder to export, and slavery never harder to maintain, the very foundations of the Southern economy were crumbling. The South's economic woes were felt most crushingly by the poorest Southerners. With the men away fighting, Confederate women struggled to feed their families, and bread riots broke out all across the Confederacy. Exacerbating the food shortage, white Southern men were subject to an unpopular draft, and their struggling farms were forced to hand over 10% of their crops to Confederate officials. Nevertheless, plantation owners often found a way around these laws. Wealthy Southerners, who had advocated most strongly for secession, suffered the least from its consequences, a fact that was not lost on many struggling Confederates. As morale plummeted, desertion soared. Confederate soldiers, worried for their families, attempted to slip back to their farms. This steady loss of manpower proved a persistent problem for the already outnumbered South. Some deserters even attempted to resist the Confederacy through force of arms, waging a guerrilla war within the heart of Confederate territory. Jefferson Davis attempted to rally the Confederate public, but for some Southerners, their War of Independence was beginning to look like a bad bet. In the fall of 1863, the Confederacy almost achieved a key victory in the troublesome Western Theater. There, a large Union army unwisely divided itself, giving the Confederacy an opportunity to smash the outnumbered Northern contingents one by one. However, this chance was squandered by Confederate General Braxton Bragg, who achieved a costly victory over Union forces at Chickamauga, but utterly failed to capitalize on his advantage. Union troops soon regrouped and devastated Bragg's forces in the ensuing Chattanooga campaign. For many in the South, the failures at Chickamauga and Chattanooga represented a sort of turning point in the war. Afterwards, one Confederate general remarked, "The enthusiasm of the Southern soldier was never seen after Chickamauga. That brilliant dash, which had distinguished him, was gone forever." The failure to strike after the success was crushing to all his longings for an independent South. With the chance of military victory slowly slipping away, the South could now only hope that the North got tired of war before they did. Outnumbered Confederate forces doggedly fought on. Further bolstering the Union's manpower advantage by this point were hundreds of thousands of black soldiers, who Confederates looked at with disgust. Confederate commanders refused to treat black soldiers as equal combatants and often enslaved them when captured. In response, Lincoln ended prisoner exchanges with the South, condemning countless Confederates to extended stays in squalid POW camps. With every passing day, both sides became more uncompromising. In the summer of 1864, multiple Union offensives in the East and West threatened to shatter the Confederacy. In Georgia, William T. Sherman barreled toward Atlanta, while Grant began his overland campaign in Virginia. Union losses were extremely heavy, and Confederates hoped that the Northern public would vote out Lincoln in the 1864 election, ushering in a new president who might be receptive to a negotiated peace. As Sherman's troops seized Atlanta in the fall of 1864, however, Lincoln's popularity soared, securing his re-election. The Confederacy's last hope of victory evaporated. As brutal fighting dragged on, the Confederacy slipped further into chaos. After his capture of Atlanta, Union General William T. Sherman embarked on a devastating raid through Georgia that eviscerated what was left of the Southern economy. Rumors of Sherman's merciless advance spread terror throughout the South, possibly contributing to the South's rising desertion rates. A Confederate attempt to outmaneuver Sherman's advance only led to the annihilation of one of the Confederacy's largest armies, and the loss of fertile farmland destroyed the ability of the South to supply its remaining troops. For the Confederates, the clock was ticking. In the East, though Lee had inflicted savage casualties on Grant's army as it advanced into Virginia, his own forces had also been badly mauled. These Confederate losses, unlike Northern ones, could not be replaced. Outnumbered Confederate troops soon found themselves besieged in Petersburg, a key supply hub for the capital of Richmond. After months of trench warfare, Lee finally ordered his troops to abandon both cities in the spring of 1865. Southern defeat came swiftly following Lee's retreat from Petersburg. Caught outside of the Appomattox courthouse by a superior Union force, Lee was forced to surrender on April 9, 1865. Soon, all other large Confederate armies would also lay down their arms. The Confederacy's war for independence was over, but the war for its legacy was just beginning. From the beginning of the war, many Confederates believed that secession and the preservation of slavery were the best ways to preserve the status, safety, and dignity of their families. Ironically, the resulting conflict destroyed the very society that Southerners fought to preserve. As the world they knew collapsed all around them, Confederate soldiers sometimes doubled down on their cause, seeing their misfortunes as a product of Northern aggression. These feelings did not go away as Confederate soldiers surrendered their weapons and gave humiliating oaths of allegiance to their Northern conquerors. Rather, they were reinforced. Following a Southern defeat, a Republican-dominated Northern government completed its dismemberment of Southern slavery, gave black men the right to vote, and sent in occupation troops to ensure the South's cooperation. To Northerners, this was Reconstruction. To white Southerners, this was degradation. With everything they had fought for seemingly going up in smoke, the deep shame felt by many white Southerners turned to rage, leading some former Confederates to join extremist organizations such as the KKK. The South couldn't win this war, but it could win its aftermath. As Northern occupation troops gradually departed, and the South violently reimposed discrimination at all levels of society, a new narrative of the Civil War began to emerge. In this version of the story, the Confederacy had not seceded from the Union to preserve slavery, but rather to protect states' rights and to heroically defend against Northern domination. This narrative proved effective because it touched on elements of why many Southerners truly felt they had fought, while leaving out the less noble realities of their intentions. This was the Confederate perspective that many in the South were raised with. But no single narrative can truly sum up the Confederate experience during the Civil War. Confederates knew that their nation was founded to preserve slavery. They also knew that it promised to protect the only way of life they had ever known. Many Southerners enthusiastically fought for the Confederacy. Some grew to resent it, and still others perceived their fight in more intimate terms. As the war came to a close, many Southerners struggled to adjust to a world that was not to their liking, and attempted to slip back into the ways of the past. These Confederates were not heroes, but they were people, and that's what we should remember them as. Don't forget to check out Master of Command 7 Years War on Steam. Wishlisting the game helps you stay informed when it releases, and boosts our game's visibility. If you want to learn more about the project, check out our devlogs over on Armchair History Interactive, and don't forget to subscribe.